There is a silence that resides at the very center of your being, a silence that is not empty, but heavy with the weight of everything you have forgotten, or perhaps, everything you have chosen to look away from. It is a peculiar realization to wake up one morning and recognize that the life you are living is not entirely your own, but rather a series of echoes, a collection of recurring patterns that seem to dictate your choices with a precision that your conscious mind cannot claim. You find yourself drawn to the same types of people, trapped in the same emotional labyrinths and haunted by a longing that no amount of worldly success or external validation can ever truly satisfy. This is not a coincidence, nor is it a simple failure of will. It is the silent operation of a force that Carl Jung identified as the Anima, the feminine image in the male psyche, the mediatrix between the narrow room of the ego and the vast, untamed ocean of the collective unconscious. To understand the Anima is to understand the invisible architecture of your own dissatisfaction, for she is the one who holds the key to your deepest inspirations and your most devastating self-destructions. She is the lover within, the archetype that seeks union and connection, yet in her shadow form, she is the siren who lures the ego toward the rocky shores of obsession and melancholy. We walk through the world believing we are the masters of our fates, the rational architects of our destinies, but beneath the surface of our deliberate actions, there is a subterranean river of ancient images and primordial desires that guide our steps toward a destination we did not consciously choose. The conflict begins the moment the ego attempts to assert its dominance over the internal world, seeking to create a fortress of logic and predictability against the chaotic whispers of the soul. In this struggle, the ego often perceives the depths of the psyche as a threat, a darkness to be conquered or ignored. And it is here that the shadow finds its footing. The shadow is everything we have rejected about ourselves, our weaknesses, our primitive impulses, our unacknowledged grief, and it is through the Anima that this shadow often speaks. When we talk about the lover archetype, we are talking about the drive for eros, the desire to be complete through the other. But when the ego is disconnected from the true self, this search for completion becomes a repetitive trap. You look into the eyes of a stranger and feel an inexplicable pull, a sense of home or destiny, not realizing that what you are seeing is not the person in front of you, but a projection of your own internal anima. You have cast your soul onto a screen made of flesh and bone, and when that person inevitably fails to live up to the divine image you have placed upon them, the resulting crash is not just a heartbreak, but a psychological crisis. This is the melancholy of the seeker, the realization that the thing you are looking for cannot be found in the world because it is actually looking at you from within the mirror of your own unconsciousness. To live under the shadow of the Anima is to be a ghost in one's own life, forever reaching for a phantom that vanishes the moment it is touched. Jung suggested that the Anima develops through 4 distinct stages, each representing a deeper level of psychological maturity, yet most of us remain frozen in the first or second stage, caught in the grip of the biological or the aesthetic. In the first stage, Eve, the Anima is purely instinctual, a source of fertility and primal attachment. In the second, Helen, she becomes the idealized beauty, the romantic obsession that drives men to wars and madness. If the ego remains stuck here, it becomes a slave to the lover archetype in its most destructive form, a constant craving for the new, the perfect, the unattainable. This is why your patterns repeat, because you are not looking for a partner, you are looking for a lost part of yourself that you have mistakenly attributed to the feminine principle. The melancholy you feel in the quiet hours of the night is the voice of the Anima mourning her own exile. She wants to lead you to the depths of your own creativity and wisdom, but the ego is terrified of the descent. It prefers the safety of its patterns, the familiar pain of a known tragedy over the terrifying transformation of an unknown truth. You choose the same toxic relationships, not because you are weak, but because the Anima is trying to force you to look at a specific wound in your shadow that you refuse to heal. She will keep bringing you the same lesson, wrapped in a different face, until you stop looking at the face and start looking at the hand that is holding the mirror. Consider the weight of the lover archetype when it is divorced from the light of consciousness. It becomes a hunger that can never be satiated, a longing for a unity that feels just out of reach. This is the essence of the ego's conflict with the shadow. The ego wants to possess the beauty it perceives, while the shadow contains the very reasons why possession is impossible. We are taught to be productive, to be strong, to be singular. But the anima represents everything that is receptive, emotional, and plural. She is the internal she that challenges the I, and when the I refuses to listen, she becomes a source of profound moodiness and irritability. Have you ever felt a sudden, inexplicable cloud of depression descend upon you after a period of great success? That is often the anima, reminding you that your external achievements mean nothing to the soul if the internal garden is neglected. The lover archetype, when healthy, allows us to relate to the world with empathy and passion, but when it is trapped in the patterns of the unconscious, it turns inward and becomes a poison. It creates a state of divine discontent, where nothing is ever good enough because nothing can match the impossible perfection of the internal archetype. We become collectors of moments, hunters of sensations, yet we feel increasingly hollow because we are trying to fill a spiritual void with material experiences. The struggle is not against an external enemy, but against the inertia of our own psychological inheritance. To break the pattern, one must be willing to sit with the melancholy rather than fleeing from it. We live in a culture that demands constant happiness and moving on, but the Jungian path suggests that the only way out is through. You must enter the dark forest of the shadow and confront the anima as she truly is, not as the goddess of your dreams, but as the complex, sometimes terrifying bridge to the unconscious. This requires a surrender of the ego's vanity. It requires the admission that you do not know who you are, and that your desires are often not your own. The lover archetype demands vulnerability, but the ego perceives vulnerability as death. Thus, the conflict rages on. A part of you wants to merge with the infinite, while another part of you is terrified of losing its boundaries. This tension is where the trap is built. You stay in the shallow waters of repetitive behavior, because the deep ocean represents the dissolution of the self you have spent so long constructing. But that self is a facade, a mask, a persona, and the anima is the one who eventually pulls the mask away. She is the wind that blows through the cracks of your carefully built life, and if you do not learn to sail with her, she will eventually capsize your vessel. The patterns of your life are not chains but symptoms. They are the language of the soul trying to communicate its deprivation. When you find yourself obsessing over a lost love or a missed opportunity, you are not actually mourning the past. You are feeling the weight of the unlived life that the anima represents. The lover within is searching for a sacred marriage, a conjunctio, where the ego and the unconscious finally meet and integrate. But because we do not understand this internal process, we project it onto the external world. We think that if we just find the right person, if we just achieve the right status, the longing will stop. It never stops, because the other we are looking for is residing within our own ribcage. The melancholy of the seeker is the recognition that we are fundamentally divided. We are a house divided against itself, with the ego reigning in the parlor while the shadow and the anima hold court in the basement. To bridge this gap is the work of a lifetime, a process Jung called individuation. It is the slow, often painful task of taking back our projections, of realizing that the beauty and the terror we see in others is actually a reflection of our own internal landscape. Imagine the anima as a weaver, constantly creating a tapestry of your life using the threads of your unacknowledged desires. If you do not participate in the weaving, she will use the dark threads of the shadow, creating a pattern of tragedy and loss that feels fated. You feel like a victim of circumstance, a plaything of the gods, but you are actually the architect of your own labyrinth. The lover archetype in its shadow form feeds on this victimhood. It finds a certain dark romance in the star-crossed nature of your failures. There is a seductive quality to melancholy, a way in which it makes our suffering feel noble or unique. This is the anima's most dangerous trap, to make you fall in love with your own sadness. If you can stay in the melancholy, you don't have to do the hard work of transformation. You can remain the tragic hero of your own story, forever longing for a redemption that never comes. But this is a false comfort. The true lover archetype is not about longing. It is about presence. It is about the ability to be fully present with the totality of who you are, including the parts that are broken and the parts that are divine. The conflict between the ego and the shadow is essentially a struggle for the soul's direction. The ego wants to move upward, toward light, clarity, and control. The shadow, guided by the anima, wants to move downward, toward the moist, dark, and irrational depths where life actually begins. We are caught in the middle, feeling the pull of both, and the result is a perpetual state of tension that we often misinterpret as anxiety or boredom. We try to solve this tension by making a choice, by trying to be only good or only successful. But any choice that excludes a part of the self only strengthens the shadow. The anima is the one who forces us to recognize this exclusion. She is the woman of the woods in folklore, the one who leads the knight away from the path of duty and into the realm of enchantment and danger. If the knight resists, he becomes a dry, hollow shell of a man. If he follows without caution, he is lost forever. The middle path is to follow with awareness, to listen to the whispers of the anima without letting her take the reins of the ego. This awareness is what allows the patterns to finally dissolve. When you begin to see the anima in your attractions and your aversions, she loses her power to compel you blindly. You begin to see the femme fatale, or the unavailable man, not as a destiny, but as a psychological mirror. You ask yourself, what part of me does this person represent? What hunger in my own soul am I trying to satisfy through this external obsession? In the silence of that inquiry, the lover archetype begins to shift. It moves away from the desperate need for the other and toward a profound appreciation for the mystery of existence. The melancholy remains, but it changes character. It is no longer the heavy, stagnant weight of regret. It becomes a poignant blue notes of a life well lived, a recognition of the beauty of the fleeting and the sacredness of the internal union. You realize that you have never been alone, even in your deepest solitude, for the anima has been there all along, waiting for you to stop looking at her reflection in the world and start looking at her directly. The depth of this realization is often overwhelming, for it requires us to abandon the illusions that have comforted us for years. We must admit that our great loves were often just great projections, and that our greatest enemies were often just the mirrors of our own unaccepted darkness. This is the price of wisdom, the death of the romantic fantasy. But in its place comes something far more durable, a sense of wholeness. The ego no longer needs to fight the shadow when it realizes that the shadow is the source of its vitality. The anima no longer needs to trap the ego in patterns when the ego is willing to engage with the depths voluntarily. The lover archetype is finally freed to do its true work, to connect us not just to another human being, but to the very heartbeat of the universe. This is the ancestral wisdom that the modern world has forgotten, the knowledge that we are not singular entities, but a vast, internal community of archetypes, and that our only task is to bring them into harmony. As you move through the world from this point forward, you may still feel the pull of the old patterns. The anima does not vanish. She simply changes her mask. There will be moments when the old melancholy returns, when the longing for the other feels like an ache in your bones. But now you have the tools to see it for what it is. You can look at the pattern and say, I see you. I know who is speaking. In that moment of recognition, the trap loses its teeth. You are no longer the victim of your psyche, but its conscious witness. The silence at the center of your being is no longer a void, but a sanctuary, a place where the ego, the shadow, and the anima can finally sit together at the same table. This is the end of the conflict and the beginning of a life that is truly, deeply your own. The journey is long, and the path is often obscured by the mists of the unconscious, but you are no longer walking it in the dark. You are carrying the light of awareness, and that is enough to transform the labyrinth into a home. Consider the nature of the lover archetype as a bridge. It is a bridge between the finite and the infinite, between the temporal reality of our daily lives and the eternal reality of the myths we inhabit. When we are trapped in patterns, we are essentially stuck on the bridge, unable to move forward or back, forever staring at the water below. We become obsessed with the architecture of the bridge, the details of our suffering, the nuances of our failed relationships, rather than crossing over into the territory that the bridge was meant to lead us toward. The Anima is the guide who stands at the center of that bridge. If we ignore her, she becomes a toll-keeper who demands a heavy price in the form of our mental health and peace of mind. If we appease her with superficialities, she allows us to pass, but only to lead us into a circle that brings us right back to where we started. But if we engage her with the depth she deserves, she becomes the one who reveals the destination. The integrated self. The unus mundus, where the internal and external worlds are no longer at war. This integration is not a state of perfection, but a state of completion. It is a recognition that you are both the light and the dark, the seeker and the sought, the lover and the beloved. The patterns of the past were the only way your psyche knew how to get your attention. They were the flares sent up from the basement of your soul, signaling that something vital had been forgotten. The melancholy you have carried is the smoke from those flares. It is the residue of a fire that has been burning for a long time, fueled by the parts of yourself you dared not touch. Now, as you begin to understand the Anima and the lover archetype, you can start to use that fire for something other than burning your own house down. You can use it to warm the cold places in your heart, to illuminate the dark corners of your shadow, and to forge a new way of being in the world that is based on truth rather than projection. Reflect on the people who have left the deepest marks on your soul. Were they truly who you thought they were, or were they merely the most convenient hooks for your Anima to hang her robes upon? To ask this question is not to diminish the value of those relationships, but to honor the psychological reality of your own growth. You loved what you needed to see in yourself but could not yet own. You hated what you feared was true about your own hidden depths. The lover archetype is the engine of this projection, driving us toward the other so that we might eventually find the self. When the patterns break, it is because the self has finally been found, or at least acknowledged. The need for the projection falls away, like a scaffold being removed from a finished building. What remains is a quiet, steady sense of existence that does not depend on the validation or the presence of another. This is the true meaning of freedom, not the freedom from emotion or connection, but the freedom from the compulsion to find yourself in the eyes of someone who is just as lost as you are. The ancestral seekers knew this well. They told stories of descents into the underworld, of marriages to goddesses, and of the long, lonely roads toward wisdom. They knew that the woman of the soul was both a danger and a blessing. In our modern age, we have replaced these myths with clinical terms and self-help slogans, but the underlying reality has not changed. We are still governed by the same archetypal forces that moved the ancients. The Anima still speaks in our dreams. She still colors our moods. She still chooses our lovers. To ignore her is to live half a life of quiet desperation, as Thoreau called it. To engage her is to embark on the greatest adventure a human being can undertake, the exploration of the internal infinite. The melancholy you feel is not a sickness. It is the call of that adventure. It is the soul's way of saying that the world you have built is too small, and that it is time to expand. As this reflection draws to a close, do not look for a solution or a how-to guide. Jungian thought does not offer quick fixes. It offers a way of seeing. The solution is the seeing itself. When you see the pattern, you are no longer in the pattern in the same way. You have gained a millimeter of distance, a small breath of space between the impulse and the action. In that space, the ego can begin to make different choices. It can choose to stay with the discomfort of the shadow, rather than seeking a temporary escape through the lover's distraction. It can choose to listen to the Anima's wisdom, rather than being swept away by her whims. This is a slow, iterative process, a dialogue that will continue until your last breath. But it is a dialogue that leads to meaning, and in the end, meaning is the only thing that can truly silence the melancholy. You are not a machine that needs to be fixed. You are a mystery that needs to be lived. And the Anima, the lover, and even the shadow are all essential characters in that mystery. Let them speak. Let them dance. And for the first time in your life, simply watch and understand. The silence has returned, but perhaps it feels different now. It is no longer the silence of the ignored, but the silence of the understood. The patterns of your life are still there, etched into the floorboards of your mind, but you are no longer tripping over them in the dark. You are walking with your eyes open, acknowledging each curve and each crack as a part of the grand design. The Anima is no longer your jailer, but your companion. The lover archetype is no longer a hunger, but a flame, and you the observer, the one who has listened to these words and felt their resonance. You are the one who is finally beginning to wake up. The dream was long, and the patterns were deep. But the morning is inevitable for those who are willing to face the night. Stay in this space of reflection. Do not rush back to the noise of the world, for it is here, in the quiet depth of your own psyche, that the true work of being human finally begins.